It was a bright afternoon in the city, the kind of day where everything seemed normal. People walked through the busy streets, some on their way to work, others rushing to meet friends, and some just enjoying the sun. The sounds of the city filled the air, cars honking, people chatting, and the hum of busy shops. Everything felt like any other day, until something happened that would shake this quiet scene. On one of the main roads, a black man was walking, his steps steady and calm. He was dressed in a dark jacket, a pair of jeans, and sneakers, nothing unusual about his appearance. To the casual observer, he blended in with the crowd. However, to the officer who was patrolling the area, something about him seemed out of place. The officer, a middle-aged man with a tense posture, had been keeping an eye on the people passing by. His focus shifted toward the black man walking down the street. It was unclear what had triggered his attention, but something about the man seemed to bother him. Maybe it was the way the man moved, or maybe it was his assumption based on race. Either way, the officer decided to approach. "Hey, you," the officer called out, his voice sharp and commanding. The black man paused for a moment, looking around, confused. "What's your business here?" the officer demanded, stepping closer. The man blinked, trying to make sense of the situation. He had done nothing wrong, but still, the officer's voice held an authority that made him uneasy. "Excuse me, officer," the man began, his voice calm but with a hint of confusion. "I'm just walking to my office." The officer didn't seem to buy the explanation. He took a step closer, his gaze fixed, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. "You're not supposed to be on this block." "Show me some ID," he ordered. The black man felt a knot form in his stomach. He was a little taken aback by the sudden demand. He was no criminal, and this felt more like an interrogation than anything else. "I'm just going to my office." "I'm not sure why you're," he started to say, but the officer cut him off. "You don't get to talk back," the officer snapped. "ID, now." The man hesitated. He knew that showing his ID wouldn't solve anything. He wasn't breaking any laws, and there was no reason to hand over his personal information to a stranger based on nothing but a feeling. But in that moment, something told him that refusing could escalate things. It wasn't the first time he had experienced this kind of interaction, but it always felt different when you were the one on the receiving end. "I'm not giving you my ID," the man replied firmly, but respectfully. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a quiet authority in his words. The officer's face hardened. He stepped closer, his hand moving toward the stun gun on his belt. "You're asking for trouble, buddy," he said, his tone cold. "If you don't cooperate, I'm going to have to take you in." The man took a step back, now feeling the tension in the air. Around them, a few pedestrians had stopped to watch the unfolding situation. Some whispered to each other, but no one dared to get too close. They were used to seeing this, but it didn't make it any easier to watch. It felt like a scene from the news, but it was happening right before their eyes. The officer raised his voice again. "Last chance, show me your ID." The man stood his ground. "I'm not showing you my ID, officer. I haven't done anything wrong." And then, without any further warning, the officer drew his stun gun and aimed it at the man. The crackling sound of electricity filled the air, and before the man could react, the officer fired. The man's body went stiff, and he collapsed to the ground. The pain shot through him like 1,000 needles. His muscles clenched in response to the electric shock, and for a moment, his mind went blank. The world around him seemed to spin as he struggled to stay conscious. The crowd around them gasped in shock. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the incident, while others stood frozen, not knowing how to react. A woman shouted, "What are you doing?" He didn't do anything. But the officer, unmoved, kept his hand on the stun gun, watching as the man writhed in pain on the sidewalk. As the black man lay on the ground, struggling to regain control of his body, something inside him clicked. He had to stay calm, keep his composure. He couldn't let the situation get out of control. But that was easier said than done, especially when the sting of the stun gun still buzzed through his system. It took a few seconds before the officer holstered his stun gun and stepped back. The crowd began murmuring among themselves, some outraged, others confused. The officer, clearly agitated, looked around at the gathered people. "Stay back," he ordered. The man, still recovering from the shock, struggled to push himself up. His limbs felt heavy, like they didn't belong to him. But he knew he had to stand, to prove that he wasn't going to let this moment break him. With some effort, he managed to get to his knees, then to his feet, all the while feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. At that moment, a man in the crowd spoke up, his voice full of recognition. "Wait a minute. I know who that is." Everyone's attention shifted toward the bystander, who was staring in disbelief. That's him. He's one of the president's advisors." The words spread like wildfire through the crowd. The shock was palpable. Suddenly, everything changed. The officer, who had not even bothered to check the man's identity before using force, now froze. His eyes widened as he processed the realization. But it was too late. The damage was done. The video footage that had been captured was already making its way to social media, and soon, news outlets would pick up the story. The black man, still trying to regain his balance, took a deep breath. It wasn't just his body that had been hurt, it was his dignity, his sense of safety. And now, it seemed like the entire world would witness it. As the officer realized his mistake, he stood there, unsure of what to do next. The damage to the black man had already been done, but now, it was clear that this wasn't just an ordinary incident. It was something much bigger. Something that would be impossible to ignore. The crowd had witnessed something much larger than just a confrontation between a cop and a man on the street. They had just seen the raw reality of racial bias, and in a single moment, a simple walk had turned into a life-changing event for both the man and the officer. As the story began to unfold, no one could have predicted how much this moment would impact the city and the nation. But for now, the black man, still shaken, slowly began to walk away from the scene, his steps heavy but resolute. The scene was chaotic, but it felt like time had slowed down for everyone involved. The officer had stepped back, his hand still on his stun gun, as the man slowly recovered from the shock. He could feel the tingling in his muscles, but he forced himself to stay calm. His body still felt like it was made of lead, but he had to focus. The world around him seemed to blur, but the one thing that remained crystal clear was the growing realization that this wasn't just any ordinary moment, it was a turning point. As he stood there, struggling to regain his balance, a murmur spread through the crowd. A man, standing on the edge of the group, had recognized him. He had seen the black man before on TV, at press conferences, in photos. It clicked in his mind, this man wasn't just a passerby, he was someone important. The man was one of the president's advisors, a key player in the government. "That's him. He's one of the president's top advisors," the man exclaimed, pointing directly at the black man. Suddenly, the mood in the crowd shifted. What had started as an uncomfortable, tense situation became something much bigger. The people around them stopped whispering, and some took out their phones to capture what was unfolding. It was as if the recognition of the man's true identity had shifted the entire atmosphere. People who had initially stood in fear of the officer now looked at him with suspicion, and those who had been quiet, unsure of what to do, now felt a sudden sense of outrage. The officer's face turned red, his expression faltering. He had acted quickly, but now, as the realization hit him, he started to question everything. His hands shook slightly as he put his stun gun back in its holster. It was clear that he was beginning to feel the weight of his actions. The crowd, now completely aware of who the black man was, grew more vocal, calling out to the officer in disbelief. "You just shocked one of the president's advisors," someone shouted. The officer's authority, once unchallenged, began to crumble in the face of public scrutiny. He had no words to explain his actions, no justification for what he had done. The shock of the situation hit him, and it seemed like he was stuck in place, unable to process the consequences. But the black man, still unsteady on his feet, stood tall. He looked around at the growing crowd, his expression unreadable. There was no panic in his eyes, no sign of anger. Instead, he looked calm, though his mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. He wasn't just an ordinary man walking down the street. He had an important job, and now his identity was out in the open. He was one of the people responsible for advising the president, but none of that mattered in this moment. He was just another black man who had been treated like a suspect, targeted based on nothing but his skin color. As the officer finally took a step back, the crowd continued to stir. People were recording the event, capturing every moment on their phones, and within seconds, the images of the man on the ground were being shared across social media. Word of the incident spread fast, and within minutes, the story began to dominate news outlets. The black man tried to compose himself. His body was still sore from the stun gun, but he knew that showing any weakness in this moment would only make the situation worse. He wasn't just representing himself anymore. His position, his status, everything he had worked for was suddenly on display for everyone to see. But the one thing he refused to do was let this officer define him, let this moment break him. "Are you okay?" a voice asked from the crowd. A woman stepped forward, her face filled with concern. She was one of the bystanders, someone who had witnessed the whole thing unfold. The black man gave her a brief nod, though he wasn't sure if he was okay. His body was still trembling, his heart racing from the shock of the stun gun. But he was going to be all right. He had to be. The officer, now fully aware of who the man was, muttered something under his breath. His face was still flushed, his eyes avoiding the man's gaze. He had been caught in the act, and now there was nothing he could do to undo what had happened. But the black man wasn't focused on the officer anymore. His mind was already racing ahead to the next steps. He could already feel the media storm that was coming. The fact that he had been targeted in the first place, that he had been treated like a criminal without any reason, weighed heavily on his mind. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake, it was about something much bigger. It was about systemic racism, the way people who looked like him were often treated differently, even by those who were supposed to protect them. As the crowd continued to whisper and mutter about what had just happened, a few people stepped up, trying to help the black man to his feet. They were offering kind words, their faces full of empathy. But their support, though appreciated, felt like a temporary comfort. It didn't change the fact that he had been wronged. The black man slowly took a deep breath and straightened himself. He wasn't going to let this officer or anyone else take away his dignity. He had to stay strong, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes, for everyone who had ever felt the sting of unfair treatment. As he began to walk away from the scene, the officer stayed behind, his head hanging low. The black man's steps were slow, but purposeful. He knew that the moment he walked away, everything would change. The officer would have to answer for his actions. And the world would be watching. By the time the black man reached the corner, news outlets had already picked up the story. The footage was being analyzed by millions of viewers across the country. It was no longer just a random incident, it was an event that would change the course of his life and become a symbol of something much larger. People were now questioning everything, the officer's actions, the police system, the racial biases that existed within law enforcement. But for the black man, the day was far from over. He knew he had to speak up, to make sure his voice was heard. He couldn't let this moment pass without standing up for what was right. As the story started to spread like wildfire, the black man's identity as a presidential advisor became a focal point. But even though his position was important, it wasn't the most important part of this story. The real story was about a man who had been unjustly targeted, a man who was now forced to confront the ugly reality of systemic racism in a way that no one should ever have to. And though the officer had been wrong, the black man knew this wasn't just about one person. It was about the bigger picture, the way people of color were often treated in society. He had been a victim of that system, but he was determined not to be defined by it. As the story began to spread across social media, the black man who had been shocked by the officer was no longer just a private individual, he had become the face of something much bigger. The moment the video was posted, it quickly went viral. The shocking image of him lying on the ground, his body still trembling from the electric shock, and the officer standing over him, became a symbol of police overreach and racial profiling. It didn't take long for the world to react. Within hours, news outlets across the country had picked up the story. The image of the presidential advisor, someone known for his work and influence, being treated like a criminal, ignited a firestorm of conversation. People were horrified, and discussions about racial injustice in law enforcement exploded everywhere from social media platforms to news networks, in coffee shops, boardrooms, and living rooms. The incident sparked outrage, but it also sparked important conversations about the deep-rooted issues of racism that continued to exist in the country. The black man, despite still feeling shaken from the stun gun's aftereffects, knew that he had to take control of the situation. His life had just been thrown into the spotlight, and he had no choice but to step up and speak out. He wasn't just a victim of police brutality, he was someone who could use his position and influence to push for change. The president's advisor wasn't just an advisor anymore, he was a voice for the voiceless. As the day wore on, the public's anger only grew. People of all races, backgrounds, and political beliefs came together in their condemnation of the officer's actions. Protests began to form in cities across the nation, with people marching and demanding justice. Signs with powerful messages like "Stop Racial Profiling," "Justice for All," and "No More Police Brutality" filled the streets. The incident had become a catalyst for a movement, a sign that things had to change. In Washington, the reaction was swift. The White House issued a statement condemning the officer's actions, expressing support for the presidential advisor and promising a full investigation into the matter. The president, in an impromptu address to the nation, made it clear that this type of behavior would not be tolerated. He acknowledged the deep concerns about systemic racism within law enforcement and promised that steps would be taken to address the issue. But even as the president spoke, the question remained, would this be enough? Would words alone bring about the real change that was needed? For the black man, it wasn't enough. He had seen too many stories like his own, stories of people who were stopped, harassed, or worse, simply because of the color of their skin. He had been lucky. He was someone who had the power and influence to get the world's attention, but what about those who didn't have the same platform? What about the countless people who went through similar experiences every day, yet their stories never made the news? He decided to speak publicly. The black man held a press conference the next day, looking steady and composed despite the whirlwind of emotions he felt inside. He stood in front of the cameras, his face calm, but his words packed with intensity. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice clear and strong. "This is about every black person who's been stopped, searched, and treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of their skin. This is about the systemic racism that runs deep within law enforcement. It's time for us to confront this." His words struck a chord with millions. He spoke not just for himself, but for the countless others who had suffered in silence for years. He made it clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. He urged people to demand better, demand fairness, demand accountability, and demand change. He knew that his position as a presidential advisor gave him the power to bring attention to these issues, but it also meant that the eyes of the world were on him. He couldn't afford to back down. As the days passed, the story continued to evolve. The officer, whose name had been released to the public, found himself under intense scrutiny. His past actions were examined, his record reviewed. It didn't take long for people to uncover previous instances of questionable behavior, including reports of racial bias during past encounters with civilians. His history, once hidden behind the badge, was now under the microscope. The police department, now under pressure, put the officer on administrative leave while an internal investigation was launched. But the black man knew this wasn't about one bad cop. It wasn't just about the officer's actions, it was about the system that allowed this to happen over and over again. He was determined to make sure that this moment wasn't wasted. He reached out to advocacy groups, community leaders, and fellow activists. He wasn't just going to stand by and wait for change to come. He was going to be part of the movement that pushed for real reform. In the weeks that followed, calls for police reform became louder and more urgent. Protesters took to the streets, demanding that law enforcement be held accountable for its actions. People from all walks of life joined the cause, recognizing that this wasn't just a black issue, it was an issue that affected everyone. The black man's actions had turned a single incident into a nationwide conversation about race, power, and justice. The public outcry reached every corner of the country. Cities that had long been divided over issues of race and policing now saw the potential for unity. For the first time in a long time, people were talking honestly about the role of law enforcement in society. There were calls for increased training for officers, more oversight and accountability, and a re-evaluation of policies that disproportionately impacted people of color. Meanwhile, the officer who had used the stun gun found himself in the middle of a legal battle. Civil rights groups and the black man's legal team filed a lawsuit, seeking not just damages but systemic changes within the police force. It wasn't just about what happened on that street corner, it was about ensuring that it didn't happen again. As the lawsuit made its way through the courts, the black man continued to use his platform to speak out. He wrote op-eds, appeared on television, and attended rallies, each time reiterating the importance of confronting racial inequality. He was no longer just a victim of an unjust system, he had become one of its loudest critics. And he wasn't backing down. The officer, now facing public disgrace and mounting pressure from all sides, was eventually fired. The internal investigation found that his actions were not only inappropriate but a clear violation of the department's policies. While the officer's dismissal didn't undo the damage he had caused, it sent a message to other officers: accountability was coming. For the black man, the battle was far from over. The fight for justice, for equality, and for the future of law enforcement was just beginning. But as he looked out at the faces of the people marching for change, he knew that something was shifting. This was a turning point in history, one that he had never imagined would touch his life, but one that he was now determined to be a part of. As the legal battle began, it felt like the whole world was watching. The black man who had been shocked by the officer now found himself in the middle of a complex and emotional process. This wasn't just about seeking justice for the stun gun incident, it had grown into a fight for equality and accountability. It was about changing a system that had long allowed these kinds of injustices to occur without consequence. The first step in the legal process was filing the lawsuit. The black man's legal team, backed by civil rights organizations and powerful allies, took action. They weren't just seeking damages for the harm he had suffered, they were demanding accountability. They wanted the officer, the department, and the entire law enforcement system to be held responsible for the actions that had led to this moment. The lawsuit was clear in its demands: it wasn't just about one officer's mistake, it was about the entire culture of racial bias that had allowed the officer's actions to go unchallenged for so long. In the months that followed, the case became a legal battleground. The officer, now under the intense scrutiny of the media and public, was forced to defend his actions. His lawyers argued that he had acted in self-defense, but it was a weak defense that didn't hold up under the weight of the evidence. Video footage, witness testimonies, and the officer's past record all painted a picture of someone who had let his own biases dictate his actions. The black man, for his part, remained calm throughout the legal process. He had always known that this wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that his actions could have a far-reaching impact. He wasn't just seeking justice for himself, he was hoping to inspire change. The lawsuit wasn't just about what had happened on that street corner. It was about sending a message to the world: racial profiling, police brutality, and the abuse of power couldn't continue unchecked. As the trial date approached, the media continued to cover every development, adding even more pressure to both sides. The officer, once proud of his position, was now facing the very real consequences of his actions. The public's opinion of him had shifted drastically. Once someone who had worn a badge with pride, he now stood accused of misconduct, and his future was uncertain. The images of the black man being shocked by the stun gun, replayed on news channels, became a powerful symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. Meanwhile, the black man's name continued to make headlines, but not for the reasons he had hoped. His position as a presidential advisor made him a target for both support and criticism. Some hailed him as a hero, a voice for those who had been silenced by the system, while others questioned his motives, suggesting that he was only using his influence to advance a political agenda. But none of that mattered to him. His focus remained on the bigger picture: the need for justice, the need for reform. In the courtroom, the case began to unfold. The officer's defense team tried everything to discredit the black man's account of what had happened. They argued that he had resisted arrest, that he had been the one to escalate the situation. But the black man's legal team, led by experienced civil rights lawyers, had prepared for this. They called witnesses who had been at the scene, some of whom had recorded the incident on their phones. The evidence was overwhelming, and the officer's actions became increasingly difficult to justify. The courtroom drama played out in front of a captivated audience. The black man, though composed on the outside, was feeling the weight of the entire ordeal. Every word spoken, every piece of evidence presented, added to the emotional toll of the experience. He was reliving the traumatic event every time he spoke about it, but he pushed through, knowing that his fight was bigger than just his own pain. Then, the officer's past began to come under close examination. As the trial dug deeper, it was revealed that this wasn't the first time he had been involved in questionable behavior. Previous reports showed that he had used excessive force in other situations, had been involved in racially charged encounters, and had faced disciplinary action in the past. This was no isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of behavior that the police department had failed to address. As the evidence piled up, it became clear that the officer's actions were not just a mistake, they were a reflection of a larger issue within law enforcement. The black man's team argued that the department's failure to hold this officer accountable for his past behavior had directly contributed to the incident. It was a damning argument, one that pointed to a systemic failure that had allowed racial bias to go unchecked. The trial lasted for several weeks, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. People across the country were glued to the case, knowing that the outcome would have far-reaching consequences. The media covered every moment, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted on the police department. The department's leadership had no choice but to address the mounting evidence and public outrage. They couldn't ignore the calls for change any longer. Meanwhile, the black man's influence continued to grow. He used his platform as a presidential advisor to speak out about the case and the broader issues of racial injustice. His words were powerful, but his actions spoke even louder. He was no longer just a public figure, he had become a symbol of the fight for racial equality, and he wasn't backing down. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. The officer was found guilty of misconduct and excessive force. The ruling sent shockwaves through the police department, but it also sent a message to law enforcement agencies across the country: accountability was coming. The officer was fired from his position, and the police department was forced to confront its own role in perpetuating a system of racial bias. For the black man, the victory was bittersweet. He had won the legal battle, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice and equality was far from over. The ruling was a step in the right direction, but there was still much more work to be done. He had seen firsthand how deep the issue ran, and he knew that systemic change would take time. But the victory in court was a crucial first step. As the case ended, the black man returned to his work as a presidential advisor, but the impact of the trial continued to resonate. The ruling wasn't just a personal victory, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been unfairly targeted by the system. It was a small but important piece of the puzzle in the ongoing fight for racial justice. The officer's firing was just one part of the equation, and the black man knew that real change would require more than just individual cases of misconduct being addressed. It would require changes in policies, training, and a complete overhaul of how law enforcement operated. But for now, he could take some comfort in the fact that, for once, accountability had won. In the weeks following the trial, the black man who had been shocked by the officer felt like his life was changing in ways he never could have anticipated. The case had brought him into the spotlight, not only because of what had happened to him but because of the bigger issue it represented. He had fought not just for his own justice but for something larger, something that many had been fighting for long before him: equality, accountability, and the end of racial injustice. Though the officer had been fired and held accountable, the black man knew that this was just one step on a long road. The legal victory didn't change everything overnight, but it was a signal that things were beginning to shift. He had become a symbol, but it was a heavy burden. He was now more aware than ever that his words, his actions, and his presence in the public eye could either inspire change or risk letting this moment slip into the past, forgotten and unaddressed. He continued to speak out, using every opportunity to raise awareness about police brutality, racial profiling, and the need for reform in law enforcement. He knew that his position gave him a platform, and he wasn't going to waste it. The victory in court was a step, but it wasn't enough. It was a beginning, not an end. As he spoke at rallies, wrote op-eds, and appeared on news programs, his message remained clear: this can't be the last step. We need to keep pushing for change. But not everyone was ready for change. The officer's dismissal may have been a victory, but the black man quickly realized that not everyone agreed with the outcome. There were still people who believed that the officer had acted appropriately, that the black man had somehow provoked the situation. These voices weren't as loud as the ones demanding justice, but they were there, reminding him that the road to real change would not be easy. He was called names in some corners of the media, branded a troublemaker or a symbol of division. But he didn't let it affect him. For every negative comment or accusation, there were 10 more messages of support. He saw the faces of the people who were marching in the streets, the people who were fighting for a world where no one would have to experience what he had. He saw the young children of all races holding signs that read, "We want change and end racial profiling." Those faces were his motivation. Those faces reminded him of why he had to keep going, even when the journey seemed long. For every person who tried to dismiss his story or undermine the victory, there were thousands more who understood that this wasn't just his fight. It was a fight that belonged to everyone. Despite the public attention, the black man remained grounded. He continued his work as a presidential advisor, but his role in the White House had changed. He had become an advocate for justice, using his position to influence the administration's policies on law enforcement reform. He worked closely with other advisors and community leaders to craft a new approach to policing, one that focused on community building, trust, and accountability. Behind closed doors, there were conversations about reforming police training, about implementing measures to ensure that officers were held accountable for their actions, and about how to make sure that Black and brown communities felt safe, not targeted. These conversations were difficult, but they were necessary. However, even within the government, the journey was not smooth. Some members of the administration were reluctant to push for sweeping changes, fearing backlash from certain voter bases. There were disagreements about how far the reforms should go and how quickly they should be implemented. But the black man remained resolute. He knew that real change would not come easily, but it was worth fighting for. It wasn't just about the changes that would benefit him personally, it was about creating a future where no one else would have to endure the same kind of treatment he had faced. The public discussions about police brutality and racial injustice began to change, slowly but surely. The black man's story had sparked a movement, and while it wasn't over yet, it was gaining momentum. People were talking more openly about race, about systemic inequality, and about the ways that law enforcement needed to change. The conversations were uncomfortable at times, but they were happening. That, in itself, was progress. As the months passed, the black man felt a sense of fulfillment. He had done what he set out to do. He had stood up for himself, for his dignity, and for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He had used his position of power not just for personal gain but for the good of the entire country. The victory wasn't just his own, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been oppressed, everyone who had been unjustly targeted because of their race. But he knew the fight wasn't over. There were still too many people, too many communities, who lived in fear of being profiled or treated unfairly by the police. There were still too many who didn't have the same opportunities or resources to fight back. He couldn't stop now. He had seen too much to turn away. One day, as he stood on the steps of the Capitol, delivering a speech at a rally for police reform, he looked out at the sea of faces before him. He could see the hope in their eyes, the determination that had fueled the movement since the beginning. It wasn't just about justice for him anymore, it was about justice for all. The black man knew that the movement was bigger than any one person. It was a collective fight for a future where everyone could live without fear. As he finished his speech and walked off the stage, a young woman came up to him, holding her child's hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Because of you, I believe my son can grow up in a world where he's safe. You've inspired us all." He smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. "It's not over," he replied. "But we're moving forward. Together." And with that, the black man continued his fight. He knew that the road ahead would still be long, that there would be setbacks and challenges along the way. But as long as people kept marching, kept speaking out, and kept demanding change, he knew they would get there. He had seen the power of the people, and he believed in it. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the future was bright, a future where justice was not a privilege, but a right for everyone.